Space Harrier. If you're of a certain age, you've probably at least seen it played in arcades, if you haven't played it yourself, in one of a few different cabinet configurations. And if you're of another certain age, you've probably played it in one of the virtual Sega arcades in the Yakuza series, or if you prefer your protagonist with less tattoos, Shenmue. Regardless of how you might have experienced it originally, the reason why you might be familiar with it is due to the fact that it was one of Sega's first true arcade hits, making its debut in Japanese arcades on October 2nd, 1985, and then making its way around the world before the end of that year. And if you're thinking, well, what about Outrun? Well, Outrun was pretty early as well, and certainly important for putting Sega on the map, but it wouldn't appear in arcades until September of 1986, almost a full year after Space Harrier. One of the reasons why Space Harrier was such a hit in the arcades was because of the hardware that it utilized, and for once I'm referring to more than just the arcade board that powered the game. You see, Space Harrier wasn't just your normal stand-up arcade cabinet with a joystick. I mean, that was one of the configurations if your arcade operator was a cheap ass, but it also came in sit-down and deluxe versions, with the deluxe versions actually moving your seat as you played the game, which is pretty awesome if you haven't experienced it, unless you're the type to get sick at amusement parks. And I don't mean from the corn dogs that have been sitting out for a bit too long. However, I should probably pause for a second because I'm sure that there's some of you out there that don't know me and are possibly confused by the concept of a corn dog. Well, you see, a corn dog is a hot dog that's covered in cornbread batter and deep fried. And you might think, well, duh, everyone knows what a corn dog is, and I would counter that with everyone except me before one fateful middle school day getting ready for soccer practice when I had my mind blown by finally realizing what I'd been eating all of those years. It's true. Hi, my name is Dave, and welcome to Zilog and Moto, the channel where I'm here to remind you that, believe it or not, I used to be kind of dumb. I mean, I still am, but I used to be also. Anyway, I'm out to collect and review the nearly 1,280 titles released in the English language for the Sega Master System, Genesis/Mega Drive, Sega or Mega CD as the case may be, and finally, as in this episode, the 32X. Basically, if I can plug it into a Genesis either by itself or with some sort of add-on, and be able to read what's up on the screen, I'm trying to get a copy of it and review it for posterity, with both looks at that original packaging and gameplay captured from original hardware whenever possible. Okay, where were we before I got off track and started talking about a food that you should never consume before going on a roller coaster? Oh, right, Space Harrier. Longtime viewers of the channel might remember that this is not the first time that Space Harrier has appeared on the channel, or the second for that matter. And it might not be the last if I ever get around to figuring out Master System 3D games. Back in the episode 62, I reviewed the Master System port of Space Harrier. In episode 162, we looked at one of the two oldest Genesis games to exist in Space Harrier 2, as it, along with Super Thunderblade, were the launch titles for the Mega Drive in Japan. Neither of those games were specifically bad, but the consoles simply weren't powerful enough to deliver that true superscalar action. Well, now we've got the 32X version at the plate. Does it get the job done and deliver that perfect port of Space Harrier that fans have been wanting for 10 years? Or does even this 32-bit version still have room for improvement? Well, we shall see, but first, a look at the package. And here's my copy of Space Harrier for the 32X, and this one's in pretty nice condition, considering what usually happens to these later cardboard box releases. It did get ever so slightly smushed, and there's a little bit of print wear on the edges, but you're going to have to be looking very closely to notice any of that. As we'll get to in a bit, the cartridge and manual are in near perfect shape, and there's even the warranty card with this one, so I'll definitely be holding on to this particular copy. In case you want one for yourself, though, this is one of those 32X games that I classify as being sort of in the middle when it comes to affordability. There's the more common games like your Motocross Madness, Virtua Fighter, and Star Wars, and those you can usually find for around $30 or so. But then, of course, there's also your more rare titles that get well into the triple and even four-digit ranges, like, say, Pitfall, Blackthorn, and even pricier stuff like Spider-Man, Darkseid, and World Series Baseball.
But Space Harrier sits in the middle, averaging between $60 and $80 for a copy. Of course, with a nicer copy like this one on the higher end of that spectrum. As far as the cover art goes, I suppose my first impression is that this is fine, but it seems a little bit off. And then I started to research things, and I've got to say the cover art situation here is one of the more interesting comparisons that I've done recently on the channel. If you like that sort of thing, I suppose. I'm sure there's people out there that just want me to just shut up and get to the game footage already. Anyway, the first thing I saw was this absolutely bonkers prototype cover that I guess was from very early on, as the game was being referred to as Super Space Harrier at the time, and well, I don't think there's much I need to say about why they didn't go with that artwork, as your character Harry, you see that's where the name Space Harrier comes from, looks more like Duke Nukem without his sunglasses. Instead, Sega of America came to their senses, somewhat, and decided to reuse the artwork from the Game Gear version of the game, and that art isn't bad necessarily, but they for some reason did a hack job on it and cropped both sides on the sides of the 32X version, so it looks pretty rough. As far as the other main regions go, everyone decided to do their own thing, and while in general I usually prefer the black and purple formatting that Europe uses for 32X releases, the art itself stinks, so this one goes to Japan, which almost has a Terminator 2 inspired targeting outlook with the names of the different creatures identified. Flipping over the back, and the flavor text is decent but nothing special, and of more significance is that they included 7 screenshots, and they did a good job of having all of them show off different levels and enemies, as it really gets across all of the intense action and how close the game appears in comparison to the arcade version, in case players were wondering how improved this would be for Space Harrier 2 for the Genesis. Although, I've got to say, they do look a little fuzzy for some reason, which is odd. One last note about the back, note that the game is a whopping 24 megabits, making it one of the largest cartridge-based games I've looked at on the channel thus far, so clearly Sega didn't skimp on the resources this time around. The manual is unfortunately one of those later black and white Xeroxed ones where Sega couldn't even spring for a color cover, but I guess those 24 megabits weren't going to pay for themselves. Sega did what they could to make the manual interesting and included a decent amount of screenshots and a short backstory, but in reality, this is a game where you probably don't need the manual, with the only real important note being how the bonus stages work when it comes to being able to continue your game and get extra lives. But to their credit, they did include a high score table and 2 pages for notes? Not sure what notes you're writing down for Space Harrier, but I do like still seeing Sega include the high score pages well into 1995. Okay, that's the package. Let's get into the game and see what's changed since the last time we visited with Harry. The first time I played Space Harrier, and I mean really played Space Harrier, was in Yakuza 0 about 5 or 6 years ago. I'm sure I'd played it at some point before that at least once, over the previous 30 years or so, but it was never more than a quarter at a time, and I certainly can't remember where or when it was. By the time I was really starting to go to the arcades around 1990 or so, Space Harrier had long since been replaced by other, newer superscalar games from Sega, so it wasn't exactly a standout machine that had to be played when you went to the arcades anymore, so I more or less missed it during its original run. Along with that, I had never played any of the home ports of Space Harrier or Space Harrier 2 until I had reviewed them for the channel, and this was mainly due to almost entirely missing the Master System growing up, and Space Harrier 2 was already practically an ancient title by the time I got my Genesis. The whole point is, Space Harrier 2 just really wasn't a game or series that was in my life until I started exploring Kamurocho as a certain dragon of Dojima. And if that sentence doesn't make sense to you, I really encourage you to drop what you're doing and start playing Yakuza as soon as you finish watching this video. You'll thank me in a few hundred hours or so. Anyway, if you're someone who isn't familiar with Yakuza, to progress in the Yakuza series, usually you'll want to go through and complete a bunch of various tasks that give you points to upgrade your character. This can be anything from eating food, talking to people, singing karaoke, etc. Well, one of the tasks is for you to get a certain score on each of the arcade machines in the local Sega branded arcade. And wouldn't you know it, Space Harrier was one of those machines in the arcade. So, I had to play it. I had no choice if I wanted those points. And while at first, sure, I was just playing the game to get the 5 million points or whatever the score cutoff was to complete that task, after playing it a few times, I found myself really enjoying it. And it certainly struck me just how much more impressive it was than the other Superscalar games included in the Yakuza arcades, like Outrun or Super Hang-On. And considering that both of those titles came out after Space Harrier, and in the case of Outrun, on more advanced hardware, it was even more impressive. And keep in mind, this was playing all three titles on a level playing field on modern hardware, so no one could claim that one of the games was an inferior port or anything like that. I never put enough time into the game to beat it, considering I was playing a game within a game, but I'm pretty sure I played it far more than any of those other titles that I dropped as soon as I hit the high score challenge. Well, except for maybe that stupid UFO catcher game, but that's a whole nother story. Anyway, so after having a really good experience with the arcade version of Space Harrier under my belt, I went into reviewing the Master System version of the game and the Genesis reimagined version in Space Harrier 2, having certain tempered expectations. In both cases, I think the game released was at least passable, with Space Harrier on the Master System being just okay, and of course suffering due to having to run on hardware that wasn't nearly as powerful as an arcade board, and then the Genesis version certainly being improved, but still not quite there, as the Genesis lacked the ability to do proper sprite scaling. And of course, it probably didn't help that it was a launch title that wasn't fully utilizing the power of the Genesis either. Basically, so far on the channel, I suppose you could say that I've had that Space Harrier itch scratched, but certainly not satisfied fully. Well, now we have the 32X version of Space Harrier. And if you want a short summation of what we have here with this version, I can safely say it's Space Harrier. I'd actually thought about doing sort of a quick joke review of the game where that's all I say before cutting to the outro, maybe as a teaser before Thanksgiving, but I held off as I was worried that there were some people out there that wouldn't get the humor. But the actual point remains. This port is Space Harrier, or at least like 98% of it. Let's go back to that Genesis version of the game for a second. Sega smartly decided to release Space Harrier 2 on the Genesis with that different title because it's not really Space Harrier, at least not truly. You may remember that they did something similar with Super Thunderblade vs. Thunderblade, as it allowed Sega to claim that both titles weren't really ports of the arcade game, they were different titles in that same series, and thus they shouldn't be expected for either game to be as good as the arcade version that came from hardware that the Genesis simply didn't have the technical ability to emulate. Space Harrier 2 specifically has three main differences when you compare it to the arcade game, amongst other smaller things. It's not as colorful, it doesn't utilize true sprite scaling, and it doesn't have as many levels, with Space Harrier 2 only having 15 levels versus the original's 18. With the extra power of the 32X at the developer's fingertips, and of course a 6-year gap between those two releases, I can confidently say that Sega was able to finally address all of those issues and release a true port of the arcade game. Let's start with the color palette. One of the reasons why Space Harrier was so impressive to me when I played the arcade version in Yakuza was just how colorful it was. It feels almost psychedelic in places, and considering that some of the enemies look like giant mushrooms, and the intro to the game specifically says, "Welcome to the Fantasy Zone," I think they knew what they were going for. However, one of the issues the Genesis has always been stuck with was a lack of color depth, and I think players certainly saw that with Space Harrier 2. Well, thankfully, with the 32X being able to display far more colors on the screen at the same time, we now have a game that actually truly brings out that Space Harrier trippiness home, and the 32X version looks exactly as it should while standing still. But what about while it's in motion? As mentioned, the Genesis also wasn't designed with sprite scaling in mind, and that was on purpose due to the amount that it would have cost to add it to the console when it was originally released. But 32X? Yeah, it can do that, and do it well. Land-based hazards, enemies, and all of their attacks come at you fast and furious, and make it a must for you to either shoot them or get out of the way ASAP, or else Harry will be laying on the ground in a heap very quickly. Between the additional colors and how all of the action looks as it's going on, for the first time on a Sega platform, we now have a game that truly feels like the arcade experience of playing Space Harrier. The arcade version of the game has some limitations, however. Remember how I mentioned that I never beat the game when playing it in Kamurocho? Well, that's due to the fact that in the arcades, there's no continuing. You can gain extra lives by making it to the bonus stages, but once you're done, you're done. Considering that the arcade version of the game has 18 stages, that's a lot to get through on one quarter, even throwing out those 2 bonus stages. When I started playing the 32X version, I had resigned myself to probably never getting to the end of the game there either. But then I discovered a nice additional feature that the 32X version has that the arcade version doesn't. And by discovered, I mean found by dumb luck, because I wasn't paying attention when I read the manual the first time. But apparently the 32X version now grants the ability to continue if you make it to one of the bonus stages, effectively allowing you to pick up where you left off if you make it a third or 2/3 of the way through the game. Personally, I think this is pretty brilliant because it doesn't make it to where you can just brute force your way through the game, and instead gives the player a reward for making it to a checkpoint. While it's still an arcade game and it's going to have replayability issues due to that, having the checkpoint system is a huge help to keep players engaged, and I very much got to that point where I was saying to myself, just one more try, when recording the footage for the game, rather than just being frustrated and walking away. Now, I don't want to come off as everyone thinking that I think the game is a perfect port. It's not. As good as the graphics are, there is some very slight frame rate drops when the action gets particularly hectic. It's not enough to really cause issues, but it is noticeable in places. Also, the default auto-fire seems like it's slower than the arcade version. It might just be me, but I definitely had a better experience when using a control pad with rapid fire, versus just holding down the fire button. So keep that in mind if you decide to pick it up. One other area in which it's not quite as good as the arcade is the audio. And while this should be somewhat expected as the 32X still largely relies on the Genesis audio subsystem, which is famously not 32-bit. However, I got a feeling that part of the reason why the game weighs in with that impressive 24 megabit size is due to Sega trying to get it as close as possible, and on a FM-based system, it's going to require a decent amount of space for audio samples if you want to do that. The result is a soundtrack and sound effects that sound pretty close to the arcade version, but just not quite as crisp. Maybe think about it like you're listening to an MP3 versus an original CD release of an album. If you're not paying attention and are caught up in the action, you won't really notice, but if you were to actually sit down and compare the two, you definitely would. Ultimately, I was extremely pleased with the 32X version of Space Harrier, and I think it did a really great job of showing off just what was possible with the 32X hardware, as opposed to many other titles on the console that tended to just be Genesis games with extra colors. And it was clearly the best home version of the game available until the Saturn version was released a year and a half later. As a result, I'm giving Space Harrier 3 stars, and I strongly recommend to anyone who collects for the 32X, you should have this as part of your library.
And that's it for Space Harrier on the 32X. Now, there might be some of you out there that are wondering about me giving the game only 3 stars if I liked it this much. And for that, I would just like to remind everyone that while technically this channel runs on a 5-star scale, for all intents and purposes, games are going to top out at a 4. And for something to get a 5-star, that's going to be a bit of a unicorn in the library. So having said that, a 3-star game is something that I still really like, it's just not a game that I feel like everyone needs to go out and play right this second. And with Space Harrier originally being an arcade game from 1985 that was designed as a quarter muncher, even if it was perfect, a direct port was always going to have some limitations due to that. Hopefully that logic makes sense, but the short version is, if I give something 3 stars, it's good. Next time on the channel, it's a game that I'm very curious about. It's a Master System port of one of my favorite Genesis games, and unsurprisingly, it's one that was never released in the United States. So other than seeing screenshots of it in magazines over the years, I really don't know a whole lot about it. Clearly, there were some changes made to cram it onto an 8-bit console, and sometimes that works out well, like what we saw with Road Rash, but then other times, well, perhaps we shouldn't even mention that one by name. I'd prefer not to have any tryptophan-induced nightmares this weekend, and the post-Thanksgiving comas are going to be odd enough as is. Well, that's it for Zilog and Moto episode 262. If you like what you saw here and want to see more, please think about liking and subscribing if you're so inclined, as it will help more people see these videos. But most importantly, whatever you like to play, have fun and be excellent to each other. Later!